This is a review of the 1995 Tim Robbins film Dead Man Walking. This was a suggestion from a viewer of this channel, a subscriber of this channel. That's right, I take requests, at least occasionally. If there's a movie you'd like me to put under the microscope, or just a movie you think that I would like, leave it in the comments somewhere on some video, and I'll probably find it, and I may get around to it one of these days. Most of the time on this channel, I review extremely obscure movies that nobody's really seen, and I partly try to describe these by comparing them to other obscure movies that very few people have seen. And this is a great arrangement for me, but I understand how it might not be super engaging for everybody out there. For the most part, this channel is just a hobby, just a way for me to keep track of what I watch. But at the same time, I am committed to some extent to doing videos that I think people can, enjoy and maybe learn from or something like that. So I have some of these longer videos about like the top 250 video or the movie from each year video or things like that. Big lists. And I'm also thinking that I probably will start doing more of these suggestions, either coming from friends or coming from people out on the internet. So like I said, if there's something that piques your interest, leave a comment. Of course, I'm not going to give any guarantees in terms of timeline. The videos on this channel are sometimes programmed a month in advance, and my watch list is, you know how it is trying to figure out what to watch on any given night. No guarantees, but I am interested in it. And I gotta say, thank you for this suggestion, because this is an interesting movie that I did enjoy, that is up my alley, and that I think will make a great video because it's fairly interesting. So like I said, Dead Man Walking from 1995. This is directed by Tim Robbins. In some ways, this film is perhaps in the shadow of Shawshank. It came out the year after the Shawshank Redemption, which Tim Robbins was in. I think that really burst him onto the scene, and perhaps was one of the reasons why he had an opportunity to direct this film that is also set in a prison. So in some ways an opportunity, but perhaps it had certain constraints, certain marketing things that came with it. It stars Susan Sarandon, who was Tim Robbins' not wife, but I think life partner at the time. Of course, an incredible actress in her own right, and fantastic in this movie. It also stars Sean Penn. The headline of this movie, I think, is Sean Penn's outstanding performance in it. If you only had one sentence to describe it, really, that's what I would put first and foremost on the list, is that Sean Penn is fantastic in this movie. And who would have thought that Sean Penn could play a self-absorbed, provocative psychopath in a film? Who would have thought? Believe it or not, he was nominated for an Academy Award for this film, but he lost out to the one and only Nicolas Cage. Gotta love that. Jack Black also makes a rare, non-comedic, early career appearance in this film. He, in his early career, actually got a helping hand from Tim Robbins a number of times. I think he made his film debut in Tim Robbins' earlier film, the first film that Tim Robbins directed. I think it's called Bob Roberts. There's a Simpsons reference in there too, by the way, in Bob Roberts. And I think he had some other opportunity in the theater, maybe from Tim Robbins as well, or something like that. Interesting piece of trivia to maybe check out. But that's enough of the trivia section. Let's talk a little bit about the movie. This is a nice movie. It is more mature than the average film, and it's a powerful movie. It's a personal movie too. It's a film that takes its time in some ways and shows us a lot of different interesting people, a lot of rare insights. Yeah, we meet a lot of interesting people in sort of a calm, unassuming way. We meet the nurse on death row, for instance. We meet the strap-down team. We meet some families of the victims and support groups. We meet lawyers who are prosecuting all kinds of death penalty cases and things like this. And like I said, each of these meetings tends to have a lot of space to just see a certain perspective. At the same time, it's not exactly laid back, because the central conflict of this film, the death penalty, death row inmates, is intense. So this is a death row film, as you probably guessed by the title, by what I've already said. Let me briefly mention a few other death row films. There's a couple of pitfalls that are common for death row films that I think this movie mainly sidesteps. One thing that's somewhat common is death row films being melodramatic. I think a good example of this is Dancer in the Dark and The Green Mile. Basically, executions and such are such a visceral thing, so powerful to watch, so sort of frightening and just intense, that sometimes directors, I don't know, they can take it a little bit too far and stick an execution into a film that doesn't have a whole lot of substance in some ways. Dancer in the Dark and Green Mile, I think, are both somewhat polarizing films, but in my opinion, both of these movies use that as a bit of a sledgehammer when perhaps the foundation of the film isn't really there to some extent. I do like Lars von Trier, some of his movies, and I like some things about Dancer in the Dark, but I think at the end of the day, it ends up being kind of dumb how much emotional energy, how much intensity they try and pull out of the execution, given some of the other premises in the film. The Green Mile, I guess, is nothing against it, sort of a standard movie that really uses the death stuff to really amp it up to the next level or something along those lines. I don't know. We go to completely the other side of the coin. You want a really subtle movie about death, as subtle as it can be. You could check out a short film about killing, / Decalogue 5, I think was expanded from. This is the Krzysztof Kieslowski film and television miniseries episode. Really interesting movie that actually has a lot in common with this movie in terms of some of the thematic and philosophical territory that it touches on. Another interesting intersection here is the film Paradise Lost from 1996, I think, came out just after this movie, which is a documentary, a true crime documentary. I don't really do documentaries on this channel, and I'm not really interested in true crime in some ways. But this is a phenomenal movie, one of the most intense emotional experiences that you can have in a movie theater or wherever you choose to view it. This, I think, is worth mentioning because in some ways Dead Man Walking is a true crime film, except I don't think it's based on a true story. I think it's based on a book. But in some ways it echoes some of these true crime sort of elements, but it doesn't really feel the same as sort of the prototypical true crime thing that's happening now. You know, there's a big wave of true crime podcasts and such. And those, I don't know, I guess I'm no expert, but those seem to be a little bit less about the internal life of people and a little bit more about the actual events, a little bit more about the dramas of justice, the way things can go twists, right, in these stories about justice, things being wrong, things being overlooked, people being misled or misunderstood. And that's not exactly what Dead Man Walking is about. Dead Man Walking is much more an internal story about a death row inmate. Okay, finally, we've got The Life of David Gale, another death row movie. That's a thriller, basically. And this movie is absolutely not a thriller. This movie is not sort of a big plot-driven thing with all kinds of twists where things go back and forth and there's all kinds of clever changes. This movie is much more like a balancing act. Let me explain more. So there's, I think, 4 different ways in which this movie's got a bit of a balancing act. There's some sort of central thematic material, I guess. What's a balancing act movie in some ways? Well, it's like there's a central theme or whatever, some central philosophical point, and then the movie's going to teeter a little bit one way or the other, right? Sort of expose you to a little bit of this side, go back the other way a little bit, to sort of keep things a bit uncertain, right? In some ways, the dynamo of these balancing act films is the uncertainty of the central thematic material, right? The uncertainty about the death row inmate, about his guilt, about how he will resolve his role in a crime. Also, some uncertainty about religion, about the death penalty, things like that. Let me be more specific. Here's one of the main balancing points in the movie. This film, I should maybe mention what the heck even happened in this movie, is about a nun. This is Susan Sarandon. Sister Helen is her name in the film, I think, and a death row inmate named Matthew Poncelet. That's Sean Penn. And basically, Susan Sarandon, Sister Helen, gets a letter from Poncelet on death row asking for help submitting an appeal. And she goes to help. The movie perhaps skips over a little bit in the beginning about why exactly she would do this or something like that. It's perhaps not as thorough as it could be. But as you get more into the movie, you kind of forget about that. Here's one of the central things in the movie, though, is you've got this nun who wants to help, but this question of whether or not she's going too far. She's entering an uncertain situation where she doesn't know much about this guy on death row. She has little experience with inmates, and she just doesn't, she doesn't know what is the guy is about. She doesn't know if he's truly guilty. And such. And so you wonder in some ways, is she overextending herself? Is this naive to reach out, right? Of course, a nun wants to help out, but is it going too far? This is one of the balancing acts of the movie. The events of the film are not big twists, but they're things that put a weight on the scale one way or another. So you think, ooh, maybe she is overextending herself here. Or you think, wow, look at the love that she's showing here. And things kind of teeter back, right? Fundamental question about helping other people and things about love, right? These also intersect with the religious aspect of the film, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. Here's another element of balance in the film. There's a great line from a movie called The Lion in Winter, which is from 1968, maybe? Yeah, it's from the 60s. There's these 2 characters who are trapped in a basement somewhere, and it's sort of during a battle or something, it seems like their death may be imminent. And one of them says to the other, "Why, you chivalric fool, as if the way one fell down mattered." Suggesting basically somebody is trying to organize the way that he's going to die or something like this. He's writing his epitaph or something. I don't really remember what was going on, but as if the way one fell down mattered, he says. And the response is, well, when the fall is all that's left, it matters. Interesting. So there's a big aspect of this film that is sort of purgatorial, right? Partly the film is about the appeals process, right? Partly it's about the literal act of the justice system trying to go through and overturn, the death penalty and such. And I'm not going to go into what happens. Partly it's about a character trying to find peace to some extent and confronting his role in a crime. Now, like I said, I'm not spoiling the movie here, but Matthew Poncelet does have some role in a heinous crime. Whether or not this is sort of some minor role, some bystander role, maybe he tried to prevent it, maybe he committed it. You got to watch the movie to find that part out. But there is definitely some extent to which he will have to confront his, actions on the night there, perhaps confront families of the victims of the crime and things like that. So there's this purgatorial aspect of it here. And here we find another element of balance. Now, this balance is a little bit different from the first balance, which is like the plot swinging one way or the other, but this is characters themselves kind of swinging one way or the other, being uncertain. I've talked to many a time about how uncertainty is a virtue in film, and this movie has that. Okay, here's another interesting balance. This is a completely different kind of balance. This is a stylistic balance that Tim Robbins had to strike as a director, and it's the balance between talking in a movie and doing things in a movie, right? So this is mainly a talking movie. Mainly the scenes consist of people talking. It's a bit like this, maybe a little bit more entertaining. I don't know. And there are many things, for instance, that could be shown, right? If the movie were a totally different type of movie. It could have been a thriller, for instance, that started out before the crime was committed and shows you everything in real time, but it's not. It's a movie that takes place after the fact, after everything has happened, and people talk about what has happened. Now, there are other movies like this, and it's a bit of a balancing act between how much you stay in the present and maybe leaning on some other techniques, right? The most common being flashback, or just restructuring the movie so that you see it, in real time, basically. Flashbacks typically aren't very good. Sometimes they can be okay. There's two notable movies that dealt with this. One of them is the film Spotlight, in which witnesses give very gripping accounts of sexual abuse. And in this movie is unflinching in its commitment to talking. You never see flashbacks here, right? They could have filmed that movie in such a way that you see the events play out, and there are movies that do work like that. But in Spotlight, they opt to focus on people talking, and it ends up being extremely powerful. Another interesting example is from The Silence of the Lambs. So in the scene where Clarice Starling is talking about the lambs being slaughtered when she was a child, there was a flashback that was filmed for that. But the director, Jonathan Demme, I guess, thought that it was too good of acting between Hopkins and Jodie Foster at the time to cut away from it to a flashback and wanted to linger completely there. This is a kind of a thing that this movie tries to sort out because, like I said, things have happened in the past. And it does lean on flashback a little bit. The flashbacks in the movie, they're okay. For the most part, though, it remains sort of committed to talking, but there is a bit of a balance to that as well. Okay, another somewhat similar thing is that movies have to decide to some extent how much they're going to be committed to this, like, okay, really sort of mature, conversational, exploratory film thing, showing things in grueling reality, and how much they're going to be a little bit more Hollywood and a little bit more entertaining and faster paced or something along those lines. This movie is a mature movie. It's much more mature than average, and you got to celebrate this for being a fairly uncommon film. But at the same time, it is not 100% committed to that sort of thing. This is not a John Cassavetes movie where the director is happy to turn his back on certain narrative conventions and is not interested, perhaps, in pleasing the average viewer to some extent. I mentioned already, this film is perhaps somewhat in the shadow of Shawshank. There are expectations for it to be kind of a certain way, which nothing wrong with that. But there is this trade-off, this balancing act of how much do we live sort of just talking about things, characters just sort of sharing their feelings and whatever, and how much do we need to move the plot forward. At some parts of the movie, this is very nicely done, right? For instance, in the beginning, there's a really good balance, I think, in some of the earliest scenes with Matthew and Helen talking in the prison, where it's very conversational at times. It seems sort of slowly paced. They just go, you're getting to know sort of the characters or whatever. And then there's some very well-chosen cuts where they move the plot along. Okay, here are the things that matter and whatever. There are also parts where they don't quite strike the balance as well, I think. I mentioned in the beginning of the review that there's a lot of nice moments here where you're just meeting people out in the world. You're just seeing characters. And these are some of my favorite parts of the movie. I think they're some of the best parts of the movie, absolutely. But at the same time, some of them, you watch them and you think, why was this even in the film? For instance, there's an interesting moment where Sister Helen is coming from the prison and she gets pulled over for speeding. And there's interesting interaction with her and the cop. I won't go into what it is, but it's interesting. Now, partly perhaps this is somewhat ham-fisted characterization trying to show, wow, look at how out of sorts she was, that she was speeding. But I think that the scene is actually great. I really like the scene because it's just a sort of low-key, interesting, personal moment. But at the same time, maybe the balance there is a little bit weird in terms of, like, why the heck was that even in the movie? It has nothing to do with anything that happens. It could have been removed, and nobody would have ever known, right? There are a number of things like that. And I wouldn't say the balance is exactly wrong, but a lot of these moments that are sort of the good parts of the movie are sort of pulling against this, like, pacing thing in some way. So you can definitely tell that they've had to balance it. And more or less, they pull off the balance between this mature film and a more Hollywood film. But it's not perfect. Okay. Who knew there could be so much balance? So next, we got to talk about politics some, right? So this movie invokes the political in a number of different ways. For instance, early on, there's a nice line from Poncelet who says, he brings up class early on when he's talking about to Sister Helen. He suspects she's from money or something along those lines. And he says, well, there's no poor people on death row, right? Which is an interesting line. Now, I will say they kind of botched this a little bit later on because they end up repeating this line in the appeals hearing. A lawyer says the exact same thing and really spells it out here, making a more preachy case in some ways, and I'll touch on that later. But the first time the line comes around is good, and it's interesting that they invoke class so early and seemingly set this up as a political film. Interesting. They do something somewhat similar with race later on. I won't get into what this is exactly, but there's a little bit of a back and forth about racism in this film. There's also a moment of discussion about local politics in this film. One idea that's tossed around at one point is that maybe Poncelet's execution is imminent, perhaps because of a local election or a gubernatorial or mayoral election. I forget which. I guess it would be the governor. And the governor wants to show that he's tough on crime on the eve of election or something like that and thinks an execution could fit in, right? And that's sort of invoked at one point. So there's a lot of sort of political content floating around here. And this is an interesting thing in some ways. I think that in some of the weaker points of the movie are some of these political moments, right? There's an exchange, for instance, where Helen tells somebody sort of, hey, you shouldn't be racist or whatever. And there's a little bit like, it's a little bit of a clever zing that she gives to this person who is a racist or whatever. And that's like, obviously I agree politically, but that's sort of not the most subtle part of the movie and not the most complex or interesting part of the movie. And I think these parts where you get into the more political, there are some more preachy moments that I think are my least favorite part of the movie. Now, at the same time, some of the political moments I think are pretty interesting because, like I said, it starts out with Poncelet invoking class. Later, there's some talk about race. And while in some ways you think that it's going to be a political movie, on the other hand, some of these things end up being sort of smokescreens for some other psychological uncertainty, right? Poncelet brings up class, again and again, maybe as some sort of power play, maybe because of some sort of insecurity or psychological uncertainty, which you can imagine a death row inmate having, right? So I think that in some ways, the political moments do come back around, despite there being some preachy moments here and there, which you just plug your ears or something. I mean, they're not horrible, but some of the weaker points are these like preachy things. At the same time, these political moments do have sort of psychological underpinnings that are kind of interesting. Now, by far the biggest political element of the film is this question about the death penalty itself, right? And it's an interesting question. I mean, executions are weird. Public executions in particular, the idea that people would go to watch somebody being executed is a strange idea. And I'm not saying that in that it's like inherently like, these people are inherently wrong or silly or something like that, but it is a bizarre and an intense turn of events that's powerful. And I mean, I touched earlier how, there's movies that have executions in them. It can be sort of intense, or movies that focus on execution. It's not, I'm not going to guarantee that that we get all the way through in this case. But in some of these other movies I mentioned, you do. Either way, yeah, I mean, like I said, this movie is clearly in some ways making a case about the death penalty, and I have somewhat mixed feelings about how this goes. For one thing, there's a scene in the movie where there's an appeal hearing for Poncelet, and he has some lawyer who does a lot of death row sort of things, who comes in, and you see sort of the speech. And this is sort of a classic, like, this doesn't seem like totally legit legal proceedings here, but I don't exactly know what the format of the appeals hearing is, and so maybe it is the case that the lawyers can just make speeches about whatever the heck they want to, and there's basically no format. Probably not, but who knows? In this appeal hearing, the lawyer does not talk about the facts of the case, but instead makes an overarching point about the death penalty. This is when I mentioned that they bring back this line that there are no poor people on death row, right? And he says, well, Poncelet is poor, he didn't have a good lawyer or something. And he had some compelling points for ways that his initial counsel may have fallen short. But at the same time, I think you would never go into this sort of situation with a specific case that you're trying to appeal and make a broad claim about the death penalty itself, which has already been settled in much higher courts or whatever. And so this is a little bit of an eye roll moment in some ways, and it's a place where there's a little bit of transition here, because in some ways the movie is about Poncelet himself, the crime. In other ways, it's not really about the crime at all, partly because it's more about sort of Poncelet's internal life. Is the focus and less about the facts of the case, but even more so because the movie also transitions to a number of points at a number of times to being more about the death penalty in general, which is potentially fine. But is this movie a rigorous back and forth about the death penalty? Well, it's not bad. You get a lot of different views, but it's not all the way there. For instance, it never answers this question: why are people in favor of the death penalty? Well, it does, but it answers it only for a certain subset of people, which are victims, right? So, there's some lines in the movie where they say, my brother, he was never, this is the father of one of the deceased speaking. He says, my brother, he was never in charge of the death, never in favor of the death penalty until he had to go confirm my daughter's dental records and, held her jawbone in his hand or something like that. And it's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. If your child dies, I could understand how you might become in favor of the death penalty. Now, there are also many people who might find some form of forgiveness or might cope in some other way that's not purely a punitive view of justice or something like that. But, like I said, this is not the complexity of the death penalty. Why are the parents of the victims potentially in favor of the death penalty? That's not the complexity, right? So the question of, why are other people in favor of it is a very interesting question that I have ideas about it, general cultural ideas or ideas about responsibility or something like that, or general ideas about justice and vengeance in this country. A lot of very interesting questions. And the movie comes close to some of these questions, but it could be a little bit more incisive in that way. And rather than being, I think, a rigorous intellectual overview of the death penalty, this movie maybe falls a little bit more onto the side of a somewhat, not didactic exactly, but it's an ideological piece against the death penalty, right? I think there's no hiding this. This movie is against the death penalty ideologically. And, nothing wrong with that. That's I agree with that personally, but you definitely lose subtlety points there. So, I don't know. In general, I think, like I said, it is a good exposition of things, a powerful film with a lot of interesting characters and a lot of interesting different viewpoints on it. And there is some subtlety. I don't mean to say that there's no sense of this. You do see a lot, from victim support groups. The parents of some of the victims are interesting characters. I think some of the stronger characters in the movie, actually, some of the better scenes. But is it a rigorous intellectual overview of the death penalty? Well, not quite exactly. Okay. One more thing about the movie that is somewhat interesting. This is a pitfall that I think the movie does fall into a little bit. It's a very common issue, which is the old agnostic nun problem. Basically, it's somewhat common in movies that are about religious figures, but where the movie is aimed at a mainstream audience, for the religious figures to not actually be very religious, right? To be a little bit more hip, a little bit more with the times or something like that. Sometimes this is an especially big problem in historical films, right? Or if it's not an explicitly religious figure in a historical film, often the protagonist in a historical film is not as anachronistic as they should be, right? Is miraculously progressive, does not fit the time, but fits instead the views of the audience, which, of course, makes sense. But it is a bit of a pitfall, and this movie falls into it to some extent. So the Sister Helen in this film is, not an unreasonable character by any means. She is a nun, who is a little bit more on the progressive side of things. For instance, her order doesn't wear habits out in public. She lives in like a black community, helping out local children and things, doing nun sort of work and teaching, and all these things. Seems committed to helping the poor, to helping the needy, right? Loving and all that thing and all that stuff. Okay, that all checks out. At the same time, there are a number of places where faith is conspicuously missing from the film. There are a number of things that would almost certainly be framed in terms of faith in, for a real nun that are not in this case. And it's one of the interesting push-pulls of the movie. There are many times where it's brought up that Sister Helen isn't wearing a habit. Okay, fair enough. She's a little bit more progressive. There's a chaplain who oversees death row or whatever, who is a much more conservative, traditional religious figure than Sister Helen is, who doesn't really approve of her means to some extent. And that's a fine conflict, but one thing that is a little bit odd about it is that Sister Helen herself does not seem particularly committed to a certain religious outcome for Matthew or something along those lines. Like I said, let me just leave it at, there are certain things in the movie that you would expect to be more explicitly framed as religious moments by Sister Helen that are not. And you do fall a little bit into the old agnostic nun trap. Now, does this spoil the movie? No, of course not. It makes for a pretty good character and a pretty interesting character. But I think maybe ding a few other more points off the subtlety score here for that character. Generally speaking, though, Susan Sarandon is fantastic in this movie, and Sister Helen is an incredibly natural, great character. I think my favorite moments from her, there's a moment in the film where she is lying in a bed. I don't want to spoil any of it, but if you know, you know. She's lying in a bed after something somewhat surprising and traumatic may have happened, and the way that she is immediately sort of sits up and is asking people questions, is just so herself, somewhat persnickety, independent, is really vivid, really like that. So, overall, nice movie. Like I said, I'm glad that this was suggested to me. This is not only more of a me kind of movie compared to the average thing, but I think it's a good movie. It's a powerful film, and it's a somewhat uncommon movie. This movie, I think, gets a little bit better as it goes along. I mentioned earlier, there's a couple things in the beginning that could maybe be more thorough. For instance, we sort of see Sister Helen run off to help out this Poncelet guy before she even really looks up his case or looks at like some of the interviews he's done on television, which might later come into play in the plot or something like that. And you just think, surely you would do a little bit more here. But like I said, beginning of a movie, you get into it a little bit more, and it does get more thorough as things go on, without a doubt. Another thing that's interesting about this movie is that it depends very heavily on acting. And for the most part, this is great, because this has a lot of great performances in it, not just from Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn, but from a lot of the supporting characters, too. That said, there are also some weaker points. There are some performances that are not as good, like Jack Black is not very good in this movie. Although I will say that one of the strongest scenes of the entire movie is Jack Black is in it. It's with Poncelet and his family. Incredibly, that's a great scene. But there are, like I said, there are a couple of places where the film loses momentum slightly just because of weaker performances. The final thing I note about this movie is that it is a pretty 90s movie in terms of style. Music is kind of interesting. The opening of it is like, wow, very 90s. It has some sort of very 90s flashbacks throughout. This isn't really a good thing or a bad thing, but something to note. So that's Dead Man Walking. Overall, like I said, happy to do requests at least every once in a while. So keep them coming to some extent, I guess. And yeah, enjoyed watching this movie. And generally speaking, I would recommend that you check out the 1995 film Dead Man Walking.